Hello and welcome to Anchored. I am Justin Coons and I'm here today with Brian Bush, pastor of Horton Flats Baptist Church. We are glad that you joined us in the podcast section of our church website. Within this section, you are going to find several discussions related to major issues going on in the world around us. And Brian, for example, the topic that we're going to be discussing today, you and I have had several conversations about. And I've always heard you made the remark that this is the most critical issue that our nation is facing.
Yeah, I have had this discussion with you. I've even made this statement in classes from the pulpit, and I do believe that of all the issues that we have faced as a society and a country over the past 2 decades, this one is the most critical because it stands to be the most detrimental.
But how do you respond to people who don't view this as so detrimental to our nation? We see it a lot in the media and even research studies that is trying to bring out this topic of same-sex marriage as something that's positive, something that's good for our nation.
Yeah, even secular psychologists and the studies that they are presenting now showing that there are no negative effects, actually positive effects, to families that are created with same-sex couples and with children, and that it's actually showing that there's no apparent negative effect on a sociological aspect. But that's really not the issue. You know, the issue is, from a biblical perspective, are there consequences in a society or a country that embraces, even advocates, at this point applauds same-sex marriage?
So are you referring to a biblical reference here that we find in Leviticus regarding homosexuality?
You know, I'm familiar, obviously, with what the Bible teaches in the Old Testament concerning homosexuality, and I've heard all of the arguments. Those who would claim that our translation is bad and that, the term for homosexuality is actually not what we think it is, and that, the term abomination. But to be honest with you, any credible Bible scholar, if he approaches, let's say, Leviticus, for instance, in an unbiased manner, will tell you that the translation is accurate. And so, as far as understanding or whether or not we believe homosexuality is a sin, you don't have to go any further than Leviticus. But that's really still not the issue. You know, the issue is whether or not a society that embraces homosexuality, if there are detrimental consequences to a society that would embrace homosexuality, advocate homosexuality. If you move to the New Testament, in particular, Paul's letter to the Christians at Rome, you actually find what I believe is the reasoning behind why so many Christians are taking such a hard stand against this same-sex movement and the redefining of marriage, because it actually signals something in our world. And so, I guess Romans chapter 1 to me is the best place to answer for people who may ask the question, well, why are Christians so adamant about same-sex marriage? It doesn't seem to be hurting anybody. It doesn't seem to be having any kind of negative effects on the world around us. By and large, and I understand this, when you talk about the homosexual community, you're talking about some very credible people as far as citizens.
Right.
You're talking about, in many cases, very professional people whose earning power and they're giving back to the community, probably are at a level that are greater than, many other people in the world today. And I don't argue with that. It's still not the issue. The issue is does homosexuality, same-sex marriage, does it have, from a biblical standpoint, does it have consequences? And I believe that it does.
But just one second. You mentioned Paul's letter to Rome. Now, does Paul say anything in particular regarding homosexuality?
Yes, he does. In the first chapter, almost at the end of the chapter, Paul talks about homosexuality. He talks about homosexuality in regards to women and homosexuality in regards to men. Most people zero in on that, and you hear a lot about that in the same-sex argument today. And it's a good argument, but to really understand what is being said there, you got to look at it from the broad picture. You got to back up a little bit in the verses, because actually what you will find, and this is why I am so adamantly against same-sex marriage and homosexuality, and not just take a stance against it, but this is why, from my understanding, I make statements like, this is the most critical point of all the issues that we faced. This is the most critical point. And it actually begins because what you find in that first chapter, beginning in verse 18 actually, Paul sets a pattern to the devolving of societies.
So are you saying that there is a pattern of deterioration that includes homosexuality in our society here in Romans chapter 1?
Yeah, actually, when you read it, and I would encourage people to get their Bibles and read it, but when you read that passage of Scripture, what you're seeing, there's a debate over exactly what Paul was talking about as far as what society. There are those who believe that when Paul is describing a society that is deteriorating, ultimately leading to judgment, God's wrath, that he was talking about the world pre-flood. There are those who believe that Paul was talking about ancient Babylon. There are those who believe that Paul was actually referring to the Roman Empire, and that, a lot of the things that Paul had to say there, Rome was already engrossed in, and obviously they hadn't fallen yet, but ultimately they would.
It would lead there.
Yeah. My point is this. It really doesn't matter, because whether you're talking about pre-flood society, whether you're talking about ancient Babylon, whether you're talking about Rome, you may be talking about a variety of other ancient nations and empires and cities. The interesting thing is that the pattern that he lays out here can be applied to everyone. In other words, every single nation, city, society that have fallen, that's recorded for us, follow this pattern.
Well, could you quickly take us through what Paul is saying here?
If you were looking at chapter 1 of Romans and the latter part beginning in verse 18, and you wanted to outline it, basically what you would find is this. First of all, obviously, the presentation begins with a people who know God, who acknowledge God. And then very quickly you'll notice in the verses that he begins talking about a people who are falling away from God. They're wondering. They're wondering in their thoughts, in their minds. They're wondering in their hearts. And so basically they're looking in other directions, looking away from God. Take that for a verse or two, and then he makes a transition in the next set of verses. And the next transition is idolatry. That this society that he's talking about went from falling away from God to replacing God. Idolatry, dethroning God, and of course in the ancient world it was stones and wood and whatever that they were worshiping. After the idolatry in this passage, the next phase in this society that was deteriorating, they moved to what Paul refers to as dishonoring their bodies, sexual immorality. And from sexual immorality, that's where in this particular chapter, that then we find the verses where he talks specifically about homosexuality, and whether you're talking about women or whether you're talking about men, he actually addresses both. So he moves from falling away from God to adultery, replacing God, to sexual immorality, and ultimately leading to homosexuality. And then he talks about a debased mind. Some translations refer to it as a reprobate mind. And basically what that means is a place where a people start calling evil good because they don't know the difference. That evil actions, have a positive impact on their world.
Yeah, we see that.
And then the interesting thing there is that in the latter part of that chapter, what follows immediately in a society that society, whatever it may have been, whether it was pre-flood, Babylon, Rome, whatever, at the end, let's take Rome for instance. History records that at the end of ultimately the fall of Rome, sexual immorality was high, but there was a point where sexual immorality moved to perverse sexual immorality or homosexuality. What Paul describes in this pattern is once this society that he's talking about got to that point, what followed was God's judgment.
So are you saying that our nation is reflecting this pattern that we see here in Romans?
Yes. As a matter of fact, if you go back, at the conception of this country, there was no question about God's role. Now, regardless of what our contemporary society is teaching today, it's an historical fact that in the beginning, by and large, our founding fathers were very much creationists. But something happened around in the 1850s, 1860s, a man by the name of Charles Darwin on the scene started presenting his theories of evolution, which started to question. Minds started to wander, hearts started to wander, started to question the validity of creationism, and maybe that's not the case. Maybe man evolved over millions of years, and you have the survival of the fittest, and that sort of thing. Well, if we jump up just a few years to 1880, from the theories of Darwin, a group was on the rise known as the Freethinkers. Spearheaded by a gentleman by the name of Robert Ingersoll, who was a politician, but he was also a teacher and a lecturer. Now, he kind of spearheaded this movement, and what happened is that people not only started questioning the creation account, but people also started questioning other aspects of Christianity and Christian teaching at that time. Huge surge of interest in the country in comparison to where we had come from. Well, jump up to 1925 to the Scopes monkey trial, and I know everybody is somewhat familiar with the Scopes monkey trial, but basically what happened there was that even though it was against the law in this country, there was a biology teacher in Tennessee who taught the theory of evolution along with creationism, I should say, and he was taken to trial. Ultimately, he was acquitted on a technicality, but that kind of set the foundation, because from the Scope monkey trial, it just exploded in this country, and people started really studying and entertaining these various theories and ideologies concerning creationism, concerning other aspects of the Christian. And here's the thing I should note, and this goes along with Paul's pattern. Once you start questioning creation, the start of things, if you can question that, then you can question anything else that follows. And so we've seen that happen. What happened was, if you jump up to the 1960s, you have this evolution ideology kind of flowing through the country now. In the 1960s, we started seeing Supreme Court rulings, various rulings on prayer, on the Bible. We saw in 1973, the Roe versus Wade was a huge, pivotal moment in this nation's existence. The 1960s was what is many people refer to. We had the sexual revolution, and we're actually feeling the effects of the sexual revolution of the 60s even now. So we have this this movement. You can trace it all the way back to Darwin's theory of evolution that's taking place in our country. Then you jump up to the new millennia, and where we started attempting to redefine marriage in this country from a legal standpoint and also from a philosophical standpoint. And then the last couple of years, we've had a huge push in the same-sex marriage agenda. So the interesting thing, and the basis of my concern, is that when you take the pattern of Paul and how he explained not only the deterioration of a society, but ultimately its judgment, if you take that pattern and apply it to the last 150 years, there is a strong similarity in what's going on, what's happening in our country today. And so the homosexuality and the issue of homosexuality, it is big. It's big because it is one phase of a pattern that ultimately leads to God's judgment. What concerns many of us is that if that be true, then what we're seeing in our world today is the last phase before God's judgment. So, it's not just looking at the Levitical account and what God says about homosexuality. It's the consequence. And again, I realize that from a social standpoint, all of these studies that are coming out and saying, what positive, and you hear a lot of people talking about the world is evolving.
Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off there, but that reminds me, not too long ago, I was sitting in on a graduation of my own, and there was a keynote speaker, and he was talking all about social work and how everything is evolving. And one of the major topics that he mentioned was the same-sex marriage, and that it's getting a lot of attention, and how that's very positive. It's a good thing. And I remember just sitting there thinking, this isn't a sign of evolving. And just sitting there wondering how many people in this room were agreeing with what he was saying. So we look at this pattern, it's almost like setting up a thing of dominoes and just letting them fall. You can trace it back.
Here's the thing. If we don't fall into this pattern, we will have been the exception for thousands of years. We have this mentality in our world today that we are going to be the exception. Even in the Christian realm, we have the mentality that we're going to be the exception, that, realize that, judgment fell from the very beginning. Judgment fell historically through all of these nations and all of these various societies, but we are going to be the exception.
You can't change the facts of God.
Yeah.
You can't change those facts. And God doesn't change.
It's foolish for us to believe. And that's why, and I don't expect the world to embrace what we're talking about here. Again, this is from a biblical perspective because I believe that the Bible is true. I don't believe there was a mistranslation. I don't believe that, that's the God's viewpoint on homosexuality changed, through the ages, that it's only relative and not absolute. I don't believe that, and I don't expect the world. What I would encourage Christians to do is to understand the world in which they are living in. That it's not okay for us to, we may not be advocating same sex, but we need to see it as something that is not positive but detrimental. It's detrimental because it falls into the pattern of a society that deteriorated to the point that ultimately God's judgment.
Right, like it immediately started after a falling away, and then they're just kind of spiraled out of control. And so if we don't take a stance somewhere, we're taking a stance, whether we like to think it or not.
The one of them, I guess, of the more thought-provoking questions anytime I talk about this is that inevitably I will get the question, is it too late? Have we crossed the line? It's a very good question because one of the things that I believe, if you study the first chapter of Romans, is that when Paul talks about that reprobate mind, there is a point of no return. Certainly the society that Paul was describing here crossed a line, and it was a point of no return. It's when you get to the point of the debased mind or the reprobate mind. The question for us, and it is an unnerving question, are we living in a society that has crossed the line?
Are you entertaining that? Do you believe that for our society?
Well, let me answer it in this manner. If nothing changes, if we continue on this pattern, God's judgment is coming. Through all of our arrogance in this country, God's judgment is coming. What I believe is that God's judgment is coming in one of two ways. And I'm not making predictions and wouldn't make predictions. Point is, God's judgment is coming. So either this nation is going to reap what it is sowing, or this very well could signal the rapture of the church. Very close. Now, and I wouldn't dare make predictions. Only God knows those sort of things. But we live in interesting times, and I think it just underscores the reality that as God's people, we need to be students of the Bible. We need to understand what the Bible says. We need to understand the times in which we live, because irregardless whether this is it, our devolving to the point where it's signaling that the end is near, or our devolving is signaling that judgment is coming in another way. I think again is the point is clear. We need to understand the society in which we live. I think it is important for Christians to know why that we take the stance that we do against same sex. This is not intolerant. This is not a hate discussion. My viewpoints are, there are good people who embrace this lifestyle. I understand that. That's not the issue. The issue is, what does God say, and what does it say about a society that has come to the point that we are feeling like that something great is happening, a great change, and there is a change happening, but the evolution, if you will, if you want to use that word, the evolution that's happening in our country is not a positive.
Right.
It's negative.
Right. It's almost like we're believing a lie.
And it has negative consequences. One way or the other. Let me put it simply like this. One way or the other, this path is going to bring negative consequences.
Well, Brian, I appreciate you sitting here and us having this conversation. And like I said earlier, you and I have discussed this topic several times, but I'm really glad that we got this opportunity to let our listeners hear it from this perspective, because before you and I had talked, I've never heard it put like this. Our nation not only has fallen away from God, but we are following this pattern that you're discussing, that Paul's talking about here in Rome. And it's not a matter of how good a person is, or it's beyond that point. It's beyond the point of it being a sin as much as it is we're facing judgment, and we're going to be facing judgment. And so it's my prayer, I'm sure it is your prayer, that the listener right now has at least gained something, some food for thought for them in their own personal studies, and maybe for fellow Christians to understand why we take the stance that we do regarding same-sex marriage. But we both thank you for joining us as we discuss this topic. And you can actually email Brian, ask him any questions that you have regarding this topic, or any ideas that you have for future discussions that we could share together. And please check back with us, as we will be updating our podcast section frequently. So until next time, this has been a discussion from Anchored.